Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Vale. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, and you are in the Stream and Buffer Protection webinar series. So again, this is a Zoom webinar. We have it set up so that you don't need to have your camera turned on and you won't be able to speak, but we encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then also the Q&A function during the talk to ask any questions that might come up. So thank you so much to our sponsors. This workshop webinar series has been organized by the Hudson River Watershed Alliance and the Hudson River Estuary Program, and sponsored by the Hudson River Estuary Program in cooperation with NUIPIC. For those of you who don't know us, the Hudson River Watershed Alliance works across the Hudson River watershed to unite and empower communities to protect their local water resources. And we do this through education, training, and networking. And you might be familiar with some of our past workshops, which looked like this. This was the workshop we held around this time last year on stream connectivity. And now it looks a lot more like this. This is probably a site that you're very familiar with at this point. This was our Watershed Roundtable in the spring. So the Hudson River Watershed Alliance works to support local watershed groups, improve intermunicipal coordination on water issues, and communicate as a collective voice. And now I'm going to hand it over to Beth Ressler to give an introduction from the Hudson River Estuary Program.
Thanks, Emily. So the Hudson River Estuary Program is a program of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our mission is to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. And you can see the map here on the right-hand side shows the area that we cover, the watershed of the tidal Hudson. And our mission is built around these 6 benefits that are on this slide, and we're really excited to be working with the Watershed Alliance to organize this set of webinars about streams and buffers, because these systems are so important to meeting all of these key benefits that are on this slide. And I think a lot of our speakers are going to get into the details of that, and I also am going to be speaking in the next webinar next week, and I'll go into some of the details of some of the resources from the Hudson River Estuary Program specifically related to streams and buffers. And with that, I'll turn it back to Emily.
Great, thanks, Beth. So why are we talking about stream buffers today? The area where land and water meet is extremely important for stream health. And we know it's important for stream health from a water quality perspective, when we're thinking about flooding, when we're thinking about habitat, both aquatic and terrestrial. But protecting buffers around streams can be really challenging, and there's a lot of options and opportunities to do that. There's been a big focus on restoring buffers through the Trees for Tribs program, which Beth coordinates and which she'll be speaking about next week. But we wanted to really focus on the protection of stream buffers as the first line of defense in making sure our healthy streams stay healthy and we continue to have them play these really important roles. So this workshop webinar series was originally an in-person workshop that was probably going to look very similar to that photo that you saw that was scheduled back in April. And due to COVID-19, we had to switch gears and reorient this as a webinar series. So we just wanted to thank everyone for your patience and thank our speakers for being flexible. So this workshop webinar series will provide information on the science behind stream buffers to understand their role in stream health, which is today's talk, state level protection and resources that are available through the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, case studies on how municipalities and land trusts can protect stream buffers, and other local tools that are available for municipalities. So again, this is the first in a 4-part series. Today's September 9th, and we'll hear from Dr. Peter Groffman on the science of stream buffers. And then the other topics will be addressed in the coming weeks. So if you only signed up for today's session and you're interested in getting more information, you can sign up for the additional weeks as well. Just wanted to mention quickly a couple of our other upcoming events from the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. Tomorrow, we have our regular breakfast webinar. It's the second Thursday of every month at 8 a.m. And tomorrow's talk is with Dr. David Strayer on the value of water, looking at opportunities for economic valuation. And then at the end of October, between October 26th and 30th, we're planning to have our annual Watershed Conference online in the afternoons with more information and registration to come on that. So thank you again so much for participating in this. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Peter Groffman to speak to us about the science of stream buffers.
Good afternoon. I will share my screen and get started here. So I'd like to start just by, I was just delighted to be asked to give this talk. I have been working on riparian buffers since the 1980s. And it's been a very interesting and dynamic area of research. And there's been a lot of good science has been done over that period of time. And then perhaps maybe more importantly, I think we've made real progress at the interface between science and society, and that we're taking the scientific information that we produce and making it useful for people that need to make decisions and protect streams on the ground. And just the presence, just the existence of this seminar series, which focused on that transfer of information from science to society, is just it's a huge improvement. You know, we didn't used to do this. I think it's always been a great challenge in science to communicate, and so I'm just delighted to be participating in this seminar series. And I get to talk about the science of buffers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about riparian zones and how they work, kind of reviewing some of the topics that Emily just mentioned, and then talk about some of the current science issues around stream buffers, about how wide should buffers be, a little bit about urbanization, and then a little bit about stream and riparian restoration as well. So let's get right into it. And again, this kind of summarizes what Emily made the point that riparian zones are just a cool place in the landscape. They're this critical interface between the land and the water. And because they sit in this unique spot in the landscape, they have unique soil conditions, unique vegetation conditions, unique hydrologic conditions. And because of those conditions, they are important to many things. And they're important to protection and support of the stream ecosystem by providing shade, by providing organic material, by stabilizing banks. They support unique biodiversity. Again, there's unique soil conditions, supports unique plants, which support unique animals. And then most relevantly to our topic, they form as a buffer zone for pollutants. That humans are doing a variety of things in the uplands that cause pollutants to move towards the streams, and riparian zones, because of their unique position, represent this critical interface. And there's been a lot of work on buffer zones for pollutants, in particular work on nitrate, which moves in groundwater and agricultural watersheds, and I'll just describe that a bit. There's been a lot of work on hydrologic control of nitrate. Indeed, the buffer zones for pollutants are really an important tool in many parts of the world at very large scales, which if we're trying to solve coastal eutrophication problems in places like the Chesapeake Bay or the Gulf of Mexico, buffer zones are an important component of that. Here's an old figure, a useful figure that was a USDA recommended specification for a 3-zone buffer model. And I think it's very useful for illustrating, to get us all on the same page about what buffer zones are. So you look at this, the first thing is their ability to protect the stream, and you look at this zone 1, and they're saying, you have mature trees on that bank, and they provide shade for the stream, they stabilize the bank, the leaves fall in the stream and provide support for the food chain of organisms in the stream. And as a general rule, it's like if you really leave the natural vegetation in side of the bank, you're going to get a lot of value for protecting the stream ecosystem. Then you've got, they specify zone 2 and zone 1. There's things you can do in zone 1 and zone 2. You can maybe cut some trees for firewood here in zone 2. You could even grow hay in zone 3. But there's the idea that you need to think, that we think different things. We have different purposes for different zones next to the stream. This figure also shows connectivity, which is what's so critical to the function of these buffer zones. And so here we have a cornfield, and we have water moving from the uplands towards the stream, the surface runoff, as shallow flow, and then also as groundwater. And so this is where the buffer zone function comes in. So I have surface runoff moving across the land. It has sediment in it. It might have other pollutants in it. And there's the hope that that water is going to infiltrate and be absorbed in the buffer zone. We have the surface flow and the groundwater flows moving through the buffer zone. And you can there's lots of opportunities for a groundwater filtering function in these buffers. You see there are roots down in the groundwater. There's organic matter and microorganisms in the surface soils. And so the groundwater has the opportunity to interact with the biologically active zone of the buffer zone. The surface runoff can be absorbed and can filter in. And so you have the buffering. So you have the buffering function, you have the stream protection function, and you have a variety of biodiversity functions within the buffer zone. This figure was originally drawn in the 1970s, and it was in the 70s when people really started to recognize that riparian zones were this critical interface in the landscape. But then things begin to get complicated. So right away people say, okay, that makes sense to me. How wide should the buffer zone be? And then this is when the scientists turn pale and start to mutter jargon terms and back away and say, well, I don't know, it depends. And what the research over the last couple of decades has been is okay, we need to be able to provide some information for people on how wide should the buffer zone be. And so there are certain things that there are many things that we've learned, right? So it depends on what you want to do in the buffer zone. So for example, if I'm interested in providing habitat for birds, I need really wide buffer zones. If I'm interested in providing habitat for birds that require lots of internal forest area, I need a really wide buffer zone. So people talk about 100 meters or about 300 feet if you have interest in certain kinds of biodiversity support. If I'm interested in rare plants, maybe the rare plants just need a small patch of soil to survive, and so I need a much different kinds of width. So one of the things that we have learned is that if we can specify what it is that we're hoping to achieve, then that can give us a lot of guidance in terms of how wide our buffer zone should be. The other thing we've learned is that there's a strong need to know the site-specific conditions in our buffer zones. And as I've already pointed out, some kinds of biodiversity require specific soil types, but in particular, when we talk about this pollutant buffering function, we have learned that it depends strongly on soil and hydrologic conditions and connections. And so in particular, if we want to observe surface runoff, so think about some runoff moving into a buffer zone, what I want is well-drained soils that are pretty dry and that are in a condition to absorb a lot of water. So I think about nice sandy soils with a nice litter layer on the surface. They're going to absorb a lot of surface runoff. These are going to be kind of dry, sandy soils. On the other hand, if I'm interested in filtering groundwater pollutants, I'm much better off with wet, mucky soils. And I'll give some examples of these. But again, I know we have quite a bit of data have been produced on if we're interested in runoff, here are the conditions that we need. If we're interested in absorbing groundwater, here are the conditions that we need. We're going to talk a little bit about hydrologic connections that can be as an overwhelming control on both the surface runoff and the groundwater filtering, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But one implication of this, and I'll talk about this as well, is okay, if indeed we have a strong need to know the site-specific conditions, so we need to map site-specific conditions, and that's important, but it can be challenging, and so we'll talk about what we're going to, where we are with mapping site-specific conditions at different scales. So here's a picture of a landscape that would be just great for absorbing runoff, and one way we have of looking at these landscapes is to map the soil drainage classes. So you can see for soil, all soils are mapped with a drainage class: well-drained, moderately well-drained, somewhat poorly drained, kind of somewhat well, somewhat poorly drained. They're very poorly drained, really very poorly drained sites. They're really very finely resolved classifications of drainage class that indicate soil wetness as it's influenced by the position of the water table. So you look at this landscape, we have well-drained soils and moderately well-drained soils, and they mean these are dry soils. The water table is 1 or 2 meters below the surface. And what that really means in a functional sense is that this is going to be great for absorbing runoff, but not so great for filtering groundwater. And so if you think about if runoff moves into a site like this, there's this big dry soil profile that's going to absorb that water. And that depending on surface conditions, you'll get a lot of infiltration in a zone like that. And you'll get effective filtering of surface runoff. Groundwater, on the other hand, is not going to be affected by this riparian zone. You can see the groundwater is deep. It's below the root zone. It's deep in sands and gravels or clays that don't have a lot of organic matter. And so in these well-drained landscapes, and you can see this is controlled to a large extent by the fact that the stream is deep. It's an incised, or it's a deep stream channel, which influences the water table. This is a dry riparian zone, great for absorbing runoff, but not a lot of groundwater filtering capacity. In contrast, here's a different kind of landscape dominated by poorly drained soils, right? So you can see here we have moderately well-drained soils to somewhat poorly drained soils to poorly drained soils to very poorly drained soils. And what you can see is these very poorly drained soils are really wet. Water table is very close to the surface. Poorly drained soils are kind of upland wetland transitions, and then you move towards the upland. Now, in a site like this, they're going to be lousy at filtering runoff, right? So if a bunch of surface runoff moves into these very poorly drained soils, they're already wet, they're already saturated, so they're not going to absorb any water, and that runoff is just going to be transported right into the stream. On the other hand, if I have a plume, say from a septic system or an agricultural field or an urban area moving through this groundwater, as the groundwater moves towards the stream, suddenly it's going to run into a whole bunch of roots, it's going to run into a whole bunch of organic matter and microbial activity, and there's going to be lots of filtering of groundwater pollutions. Now this is, these two figures are summarizing many years of research by many years of people, but it's been useful research because it gave us a tool for making some predictions or recommendations about specific spots. So if you can go out to your riparian zone and you can map the soils there, then you can say something about the suitability of that area as a buffer zone for surface runoff or for groundwater pollution. And I think that's a useful finding if you can go out and map these soils. So soil type is an important controller and a predictor, and it's a useful tool for thinking about buffer zones. A trickier one is hydrologic connections, which are harder to map, but can be just an overwhelming control of how well these buffer zones work. And so here's a picture of a landscape with really nice connections between the upland and the groundwater. So here's my upland over here. Let's say this is a cornfield. Here's the groundwater. Here's the riparian zone. This is one of our very poorly drained riparian zones. And you can see this plume of water moves from the upland, moves into the riparian ecosystem, very close to the surface, lots of biological filtering. This is about as good as it gets, right, in riparian zones. Nicely connected, good soil conditions for groundwater filtering. Unfortunately, that's not the way it always works. So we have two types of connectivity problems in these riparian zones. The first one is caused by seeps or channelized flow. So sometimes you have a landscape with a particular shape. The groundwater is flowing across the landscape, and instead of going in the shallow subsurface of the riparian zone, it breaks out and emerges as a seep. You can see these; they're very common in completely forested landscapes. A lot of these if you hike around in the Catskills, you'll see lots of areas where there's just water bubbling up and flowing perpendicular to the stream across the riparian zone. There's also lots of human-induced seeps. So if we're doing a variety of things here that causes even a little bit of channelized flow in the upland, then that's going to break through the riparian zone, and you're going to get a channelized flow through the riparian zone. And this is just a disaster as far as filtering is concerned. It's not, if you have channelized flow, it's not going to absorb the runoff, and you're not going to have any groundwater interaction. So our first connectivity problem is the presence of seeps or channels. Now, seeps or channels, you can map. You can go out, you can observe them, and you can say, oh, I've got a seep or a channelized flow problem. The other connectivity problem is trickier, is this problem of deep bypass flow. And so we would like to think that that the water table would, the water is going to flow from the upland parallel to the soil surface, is going to flow through this biologically active zone of the riparian ecosystem and into the stream. But as is true of so many things in life, that's just not the way it always is. And frequently groundwater takes these deep bending paths. The water is pushed down either by hydrologic conditions or geologic conditions, and it takes these deeper flow paths. And so in some cases, the groundwater flow paths are going completely underneath the riparian zone, and then they're just bubbling up directly into the stream. This is vexing because I can look at this landscape and I can say, this looks perfect. I have a shallow water table. I have a nicely maintained biologically active riparian zone, but really I'm not getting a lot of of filtering of either runoff or of groundwater flow because I've got these bypass groundwater flow paths. These are harder to map, and they're quite challenging. So I made the case that we have learned a lot about using information on soil and hydrologic conditions to predict riparian buffer zone function. So now the question is, how am I going to get information on the soil and hydrologic conditions in the buffer zones? And I would argue there have been tremendous scientific advances in this field, and also kind of advances at the interface between science and society, because we have all these groups now, whether they're conservation commissions or local environmental groups, who have got really good tools and they've got really good experience and going out and doing a lot of mapping. So at certain local scales, we can go out and make observations of these conditions. But at larger scales, we need to rely more on information that's available through a variety of portals. And that information flow has improved a lot. And I'll give an example here. So here's a lot of our work was done in was done in Rhode Island. Here's a USGS map. This is a 1 to 24,000 map, and it shows the kind of landscape that we're concerned about, right? So I've got a stream over here. I have some upland land use over here, some residential areas and some agricultural areas, and I've got this stream that I would like to protect. And I see that I've got some forested area around the stream, but I really want to know is, well, what are the soils and what are the hydrologic conditions within that riparian zone? Now, the traditional coverage, 1 to 24,000 is pretty good coverage. It doesn't tell me anything about what is really going on at the interface between this upland and this stream. But if I bring to bear some of these new coverages that are increasingly available, so they're high resolution stream maps, so 1 to 5,000 scale stream maps, and you can see instead of having just one stream, I actually have an entire stream network with a bunch of small tributaries, and each of these tributaries is surrounded by hydric soil. So we have very high resolution, or not even super high resolution, but high resolution, 1 to 15,000 scale hydric soil maps. And so now, with these new approaches, I have a pretty good picture of what's going on in this landscape. I've gone from this, which is really not telling me much, except that, I mean, maybe in 1985, I would have been happy to say, yeah, there's a stream, there's some forest around that. Isn't that great? I'll declare victory and say this is a good spot. But if I really want some functional understanding of what's going on, now I can see where the streams are. I can see that a bunch of these streams are surrounded by hydric soils that are going to be great for filtering groundwater. Some of my streams are not surrounded by hydric soils, and so they may be more suitable for absorbing surface runoff, or they may just not have suitable buffering conditions in them. I can see ponds on these high resolution coverages. Ponds are functionally very important in the landscape. And so our ability to just sit at our desks and come up with relatively high resolution depictions of what's going on in the riparian zones has improved enormously. I mean, this work was published in 2012, and things have continued to improve. There's more stuff available online. And then again, we can send people out in the field. Used to be pretty arduous work with surveying and looking at hand maps. And now, you know, we do this when we work with students in class, and they laugh at us. They say, you know, no, I'm not going to do any surveying, and I'm certainly not going to get the paper copy of the soil map out. I've got it all on my phone. And they map elevation, and you can identify plants and animals, and these become very powerful tools for doing these assessments either at our desks or out in the field, or some combination of the two. I think that's a big advance, and I'll skip that a little bit. Okay, so that's a little bit about about how riparian zones work and what are some of the tools we have for coming up. What are our goals for riparian zones? And again, I think we've got good science, and I think we have good tools for using that science at a variety of scales, from the local scale to much larger. Two other things I wanted to talk about were urbanization and restoration, and I'm going to talk a little bit about green infrastructure and some what I think is a very exciting area of research in green infrastructure, and then also a bunch of exciting research and application in restoration. So I think we're all grappling with urbanization. It's occurring pretty much everywhere. Its effect on watersheds is profound, mostly because you put impervious surface in these watersheds, and it just completely changes the way water moves through these watersheds. It accelerates the movement of water, and which has a variety of effects hydrologic functions and biological functions associated with that. So I'll talk a little bit about what we call the urban stream syndrome and how that plays out in riparian zones. I'm also going to talk about some of the recent research about if we want to address the effects of the urban stream syndrome on riparian zones and streams, we need an approach that incorporates social science. And we have a variety of terms for this. We call it a social ecological approach. A lot of my training, I call myself a biogeochemist. And in recent years, I've gone from biogeochemistry to biogeosociochemistry. And this is, I think, pretty widespread in environmental science that a lot of we will fail to solve a lot of our environmental challenges unless we much more aggressively incorporate a human dimension. And we got a couple of good examples of this in the urbanization. Okay, so how does urbanization play out in riparian zones? So we put impervious surface in a watershed, and it changes the way water moves from the uplands to the streams. And so here's our natural channel. We have the shallow riparian zone. We have a giant web of connections between the stream and this riparian zone. Again, the riparian zone is filtering the groundwater. The stream is providing water to the riparian zone. The riparian zone is feeding organic matter to the stream. And this is what we've been talking about, these idealized riparian zones. Urbanization, you put impervious surface in these watersheds and it just beats the hell out of these riparian zones. So now we move water from the upland into the stream with tremendous energy. The rain falls on the pavement and it goes zooming across the landscape into the stream. And it's just a lot of energy, and so it degrades the stream. So you end up degrading the banks, and you end up incising the stream just by washing away. Especially in watersheds that have an agricultural or a construction history, there's all the sediment that's piled up in the stream channel, and that gets washed away. And so we have these deeply incised stream channels. So all those connections that you see at the top are broken. The water table is deeper, so you don't have that groundwater filtering function. You don't have much flooding for the stream to feed the riparian zone. You have much less organic matter from the riparian zone feeding the stream, and you just have basically this is the urban stream syndrome as it plays out in riparian zones. And there's been a lot of research to show that has a variety of functional effects. And I think we've all seen pictures of this. You can see here are these incised streams. Here are the degraded banks. The trees are falling in. In lots of places, there's infrastructure next to the stream. Many municipalities have sewer lines next to the stream, and the sewer lines get degraded. We've seen this. We've been seeing this since the 50s, the urban stream syndrome, and more recently been seeing how that plays out in the riparian. Now we've been dealing with this problem since the 50s, and primarily the idea was, well, we're going to build detention basins. They're the kind of old-fashioned idea that we're just going to capture a bunch of the water that comes off the landscape and reduce that degradation of the stream in the riparian zone just by breaking some of that energy, capturing some sediment. So here's a picture of and this is a pretty modern detention basin, because you can see it's got some vegetation in it, but it's collecting water from the subdivision. And then it's collecting in here, and then it's being released through the structure here. Now, we built enough of these detention basins that people began to be interested in what are the larger scale effects. I can design and build this detention basin for this small subdivision, but what effects are these having at the watershed scale, and what effects are they having on other functions, in particular some of the nutrient and other pollutant buffering capacity. And this work I'm presenting here was done by Neil Betez, who was a research scientist at the Carey Institute for several years, is now the supervisor of the town of New Paltz. And he started wondering about some of these scaling things. And he made this slide. He said, okay, so here's this landscape. How many detention basins are on this landscape? And if you could look at them, this landscape, how many can you find, right? So here's the one we were just looking at in the previous picture. You can see this little shape there. There's that shape. Here it is here. How many detention basins are in this landscape? Each of those stars represents a detention basin. Here, and there's one here, and there's one here, and there's one here. And you start to realize that maybe we're making enough of these that we are restoring some of that riparian function. And essentially what we have done is we have switched the interface, right? So the interface between the land and the water used to be right along this stream. But now we've degraded that stream, we've degraded that riparian connection, but we have displaced or moved that connection. So now the interface, instead of being in the stream channel, is now dispersed across the landscape, where each of these detention basins is functioning as a mini interface between the land and the water. This is pretty interesting, and it was an interesting way of looking at the landscape, and it was certainly interesting to the people who were designing these stormwater features, who were like, well, okay, originally, we were just trying to capture some water to meet a particular development mandate, but then suddenly, if we started to think about these in a more functional way, it kind of stimulates a bunch of really creative thinking about green infrastructure, and can we design them to do other things. And what's interesting is a lot of the green infrastructure can mimic the structure of a natural landscape. So natural riparian areas, they naturally have this gradient where you go from dry uplands towards an upland to wetland transition down into a wet area. And that gradient, that natural elevation gradient, really is important for functioning, because I can be absorbing runoff, surface runoff over here, and I can get in groundwater filtering over here, and I can get a variety of types of functional zones in the natural riparian areas. And you see the same thing in lots of these stormwater management structures. So most of these stormwater management structures that we started looking at, and I'll show pictures of these, have drier, really dry zones, semi-dry zones, kind of transitional zones, and then some wet zones, kind of mimicking the structure of the natural riparian zones, but again, kind of in miniature, in an engineered, controlled setting in the uplands. So what Neil Betez was doing was, okay, so this is work we were doing in Baltimore. We're working in this one watershed, the Gwynns Falls, and we did an inventory of what types of stormwater management structures are there. So there's a bunch of these wet ponds, there's a bunch of these dry detention ponds, and then there's a bunch of really these dry infiltration practices. And there's a lot of them, right? So just in this watershed, there were several hundred of these factors. And you look at these, I guess one of the interesting realizations for us when we started looking at these is, so you start off with a hole in the ground to capture water, collects a bunch of sediment. Suddenly you have wetland plants, you have insects, you have birds. And then you start to look, this is a detention basin, and this is kind of a genuine ecological feature that is providing some biodiversity functions, and it's providing a lot of filtering functions. And so, and again, this has stimulated a huge wave of creativity of people saying, all right, we can design these to support wetland vegetation, or we can design these to support pollutant removal processes, or we can design these to support upland vegetation and types of insects and birds that are that we only find in grasslands. And so thinking about these in a functional context has stimulated really a lot of exciting work in green infrastructure design. Some of these are drier, like these dry detention structures, but they still got a bunch of wetland vegetation in the wet areas of them. You can see there's just a variety of these things that can be cleverly engineered, and they can provide lots of different functions. We started to measure some of these functions, and in particular, we were interested in this process called denitrification, which is a process that converts nitrate. Nitrate is the most common, it's a big form of nitrogen pollution. It comes from fertilizers and septic systems. It's a huge problem in coastal areas in places like the Chesapeake Bay or Long Island Sound. And denitrification is this anaerobic process, so in wet soils, that it converts that nitrate into nitrogen gas. And this is a real water quality maintenance process. And so we were really curious to see, could these detention basin features, these green infrastructure features, would they support denitrification like natural riparian zones? And so in these experiments, so Betez took samples from 5 different kinds of detention basins, right? So there's the wet ponds, and here are the wetter ones, here are the really dry ones. And he compared it with natural riparian zones, some forested riparian zones and some herbaceous riparian zones. And sure enough, these green infrastructure soils were supporting really high rates of denitrification. And this was some functional evidence that, yes, perhaps we have created a new interface between the land and the water. It's distributed across the landscape. It's engineered. And because of the engineering that really maximizes the interaction between the water and the soil, we get some real function, at least in the case of denitrification. So that led us to the saying, well, our detention basins, the new riparian zone, And again, there's been lots of kind of exciting work trying to design green infrastructure, to evaluate green infrastructure, and to use green infrastructure to solve multiple functions. Okay, the other response to urbanization is restoration, stream restoration and riparian restoration. And I'll talk about that a little bit with some older work, but then on some newer work, talking about some of the complications associated with restoration. So again, here's our picture of the urban stream syndrome. For those of you who work in municipalities, you wake up at night thinking about these sites and what are we going to do about these sites? And so our work has mostly been in Baltimore, but Baltimore City and Baltimore County has a pretty aggressive program of saying where do we have the worst degradation, the worst examples of urban stream syndrome, and can we go restore them? This is an area that has developed really impressively over the last few decades, right? So the traditional solution to the urban stream syndrome is to put your stream in a pipe. In Baltimore, you have a lot of these concrete channels. At least this isn't a buried concrete channel. In most cases, they just put the stream in a pipe. Nobody knows that it's there. And you can't really blame people for doing this, right? So we have a neighborhood over here. I have a stream that is just running amok across the landscape, and I can't let the stream eat away these people's yards or destroy the infrastructure next to the stream. So we put them in these straight channels. But these were not appealing aesthetically, they weren't appealing biologically, and so there was a real desire as suburbanization spread out across the landscape to develop more sophisticated approaches to stream restoration. And so you can see here's a kind of a fancy stream restoration project, and you can see that they're trying to design pool and riffle sequences. So you get some natural stream features. You're trying to get some meandering in the stream, very active revegetation of the riparian zone, and this kind of making this kind of natural sloping so that you can get some interaction between the stream. Now, as a scientist, we were super interested to look at these projects because they're pretty sophisticated projects. But when we first started looking at them, we came up with what we called the plastic fruit hypothesis. And we hypothesized that these streams were going to be like a plastic banana, which might look right, but it has no nutritive value because there was no organic material. Like we saw all this riprap and all this gravel, and we said, well, maybe this is going to look good, but it's not going to do anything. And you can see that he doesn't look very happy in that picture. See, he's kind of grimacing at those. We think the plastic fruit hypothesis actually was wrong, because you set these sites up and you come back a year later, and they really look pretty good, right? So there's a lot of biology here. The riparian zone very actively revegetates. These pool and riffle sequences capture organic matter. So there's lots of leaves and organic matter piling up in the stream. And so we started to collect, lots of people in many places have started to collect data that these streams, if they're designed well and constructed well, they can provide a whole bunch of biological functions. And some of these designs are really quite clever. They design different types of restorations for different types of stream reaches. So in some cases, I've got a narrow reach. I've just got to move the water through a stream reach without letting it interact with the surrounding environment. I've just got to transmit the water through it. But in other places, there are opportunities for letting the stream kind of wander into the floodplain, or letting floodwaters reconnect into the floodplain, and so we've been measuring things like denitrification or amphibians and other types of components of biodiversity. And some of these restoration projects are really really helping provide buffering functions and other functions as well. So stream restoration, and again, like with the green infrastructure, this is stimulating just a flood of creative work where people are like, for one thing, it's like $5 or $6 or $8 billion a year is being spent on stream restoration. And this has focused the mind of many people who are interested in designing streams that are going to be functional, that are going to last. And it's just a very exciting area of research. The real challenge in this research, a little bit, I'm going to point is to the social ecological component of stream restoration. And so you can see there are houses next to these areas, and we cannot deny that there's a real strong human dimension in stream restoration projects. So for example, we were wandering around in the stream and we said, I wonder if you restore the stream, does that increase the property value of these houses, right? And you think, so if you increase the property value and do you increase tax revenues for the municipality? Does that help to pay for the stream restoration? And it was a simple question. And we did some econometric analysis of real estate values. And indeed, if you restore the stream behind the house, it does increase the resale value. That's the easy part. The real part is what do people want these restorations to look like, right? So can we design these restorations so that we're going to increase people's interaction with the stream to get a nature benefit? If we increase people's interaction with the stream, is that going to cause degradation of the stream? We have a bunch of people wandering around the stream. And so the human dimension is actually super complex. We have asked, we have learned to engage with people and ask them okay, what would you like the stream restoration to look like? In many cases, they tell us things that we don't want to hear. So for example, if we ask people, what would you like this restored stream to look like? And they say, I would like a bicycle path and an ice cream kiosk. Right now, in terms of habitat, biodiversity functions or buffering functions, a bicycle path and an ice cream kiosk is probably not what I want. But on the other hand, ice cream kiosk and a bicycle path. And so there's a lot of complexity in the human dimension. And some of it is kind of positive and some of it can be problematic. So I'll give an example of one project in Baltimore, Stony Run. So the Baltimore Department of Public Works has done a very good job of prioritizing streams for restoration. And Stony Run is a stream that runs right through the middle of residential areas in Baltimore, lots of different neighborhoods. Stream was highly degraded, and this was prioritized for restoration. And the DPW, Department of Public Works, had a series of best practices for engaging with the community, lots of communication, lots of meetings. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're hoping to achieve. Here's how this is going to work over time. And they did that. And when they got out there to do the restoration, these are big projects. And so there's a lot of construction, there's bulldozers, and there's cutting down of trees. And so when the people in the neighborhood saw what this looked like, there was tremendous resistance. Lots of complaining, lots of controversy. And then the great nightmare of all of us who work in the environmental field, an article in the local paper saying, why is the city spending millions of dollars to bulldoze trees? What kind of technology is this? Outdated, discredited, and destructive. And this was kind of heartbreaking for us as scientists, and we weren't the municipal decision makers who were really on the hook with this. But it really made the case that unless we really aggressively deal with the human dimension in these projects, we're going to have big failures at the interface between science and society. Now, our work in Baltimore is long term, right? So this article is from 2006, and if you go out to and even if you go back a year later to Stony Run, it looked a lot better. You could see it stabilizes, it starts to redevelop. If you go to Stony Run now, it looks great. The riparian zone is actively revegetating. There's a lot of human interaction with that stream. There's a bunch of walking paths by the stream. You have teenage kids back there doing what teenage kids are doing back in the woods, and it looks great now, but it was a very, very painful process. And there was some researchers, Johns Hopkins, went out and resurveyed the community to see how their attitudes have changed. But we have to avoid things like this with these stream restoration projects. I give the Stony Run an example, and we'll talk about there's this idea in environmental science now, as environmental science has kind of evolved into a more general sustainability science, right? And sustainability science says we have a triple bottom line, that for all our efforts, we need to consider environment, economics, and equity. And equity involves many aspects of the human dimension. And we're learning from sustainability science that if we don't consider the triple bottom line, we're going to fail in our efforts, right? And this is the case here in our efforts to restore the stream. Yes, we have to get the ecology and the site design right, and we have to get the economics right. But unless we engage with the community, especially in an equitable way, we're going to have problems. Okay, I want to talk one more thing about stream restoration. There's really a lot of stream restoration that's going on. This is one of our sites in Baltimore, one of these old concrete channels. There's still a lot of these concrete channels across the world. There's still a lot of these basically kind of ditches around the world, and lots of stream restoration. So this is work in Baltimore County, a place called Scotts Level Branch. This is beautiful restoration. You can see they've planted a bunch of trees. They've kind of made a nice meandering stream. they're under extraordinary pressure to reduce nitrogen loading to the Chesapeake Bay. So they're very interested in making these restored streams have some ability to take up nitrogen. And this is, and I'm getting very much to the end, so I've saved my data slide for the end. But so we've been making lots of measurements of nitrogen uptake in these restored streams. And I'll draw your attention to the middle bars here, and especially panel E and F. These are measurements of nitrate uptake. How aggressively is the stream taking up nitrate and converting it into a more stable form? And you can see that in these restored streams, they are really taking up more nitrate than the unrestored streams. And that's really a good result. It's because, again, you get nitrogen credits for this. And so we see that there's a real functional benefit for the stream restoration. But the challenge is a lot of that is driven by light. So these restored streams, because all the either they didn't have trees when the project began, or the trees were cut down as part of the project, there's a lot more light shining on that stream. And if you shine light on the stream, it makes the algae grow more, and the algae take up more nitrate. So we have this nitrate uptake increase, which is good, but a lot of it which is driven by the fact that there's more light because there's no trees. And so this is a real kind of mechanistic conundrum, because people don't like the fact that the trees are removed and the trees are going to grow back. And so will this increased uptake fade over time as the new canopy develops? And I end with this to remind us that this is still a very active area of science, right? So we've been working on riparian zones for a long time. We've learned a lot of things. We have learned a lot, how to communicate a lot of that information to people in a useful way, but there's still a lot that's unknown. And so there's excitement about green infrastructure, there's excitement about stream restoration, but there's still a lot of active science going on. And this, to me, is just a great example where we've created a real mechanistic conundrum that we're going to have to sort out over time. So in conclusions, as we go on to the rest of the seminar series, I've hoped, just to provide some of the scientific basis for why buffer zones and riparian areas are important components of the landscape. There's been a lot of good science, and we've been able to quantify those multiple benefits. And I think perhaps more impressively to me, we've developed some tools for letting people use that science to actually manage actual landscape. The other thing I hope you'll take away is that this is an active area of science, and there's a bunch of kind of basic biophysical science, and how does this green infrastructure work? How does the stream restoration work? What are the mechanisms of buffering going on in these areas? And there's a lot of new science that's going to come out. I think the most exciting and challenging science, though, is going to fall within the rubric of sustainability science, where we've got to meet that triple bottom line with environment, economics, and equity. And unless we really engage with that human dimension, our efforts will not be successful. I feel that we're poised for great success because we've got this new sustainability framework and more of a focus on the bottom line. And I think we're poised for great success over the next few years. And I thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for your presentation. We've had a couple of questions come in. If you are watching this and you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask those. That'll be easier for me to find than in the chat. So the first question was where to find the high resolution stream data layers that you mentioned, if you have any advice on that.
Yeah, so you see that question, I do not know the answer. And I suspect that I would start searching in the state resources, and then county resources, and then federal resources. But I suspect that if you think about the way our wetland laws are made, the federal laws are pretty coarse. The state laws are a little more finer, but the really fine resolution laws are at the local scale. And so I would try at all those levels to see where those are. And I could do, if you send me an email later, I could ask someone to find it.
Great, thank you. We have a question. What actions result in the lowering of the water table in a riparian zone? You showed a couple of pictures that showed that level lowering.
Yeah, so sometimes riparian zones naturally are naturally dry. If it's a landscape where the geologic structure is such that the streams have naturally cut down, and so there the groundwater is naturally going to be deep. But what we see in urban areas is you think about a stream in most of the eastern part of this country. There's been a lot of agriculture and disturbance in the uplands, and so the streams and the stream channels have piled up sediment, maybe 1 or 2 meters, 3 or 6 feet of sediment have piled up in the streams in the riparian zones. And when you urbanize these landscapes and you start to put a lot of runoff into those streams, so you change the energy regime of the watershed and the energy regime of the stream, and all that legacy sediment that's piled up is very susceptible to erosion. So the riparian zone, so the sediment that's in the riparian zone kind of stays there, but the stream just gets eaten away. And it's really interesting to go wander around in urban streams, because you can see in many cases they have eaten their way down to the bedrock, and so the stream now will have like a hard rocky bottom, and habitat for the stream insects. They require, like, they call it embeddedness is the term. They need a little sediment to kind of snuggle in there, but these streams are so incised, and the runoff is so strong that you just don't have any sediment left in the stream channel. And then you can see the riparian banks. You can see layers and layers of sediment. Sometimes you can see where the original stream layer was, back in pre-settlement times. And then you can see all that sediment from human land use piling up on top. And so it's a mixture. It's definitely a combination of legacy sediment and then a whole bunch of stormwater eating it away. It's interesting. I just have to say it's interesting. This is a geomorphic process. And when we got out into these urban streams, we started seeing this geomorphic process, and we were very excited to discover this process. And then we look back in the geomorphology literature, and we realized that the geomorphologists were very excited when they discovered it in the 60s. And from a scientific point of view, it was a classic example of sometimes we think we're discovering something new, but if we do some scholarship, we find out that other people have found the same thing in many years before us too.
Thank you. Can you speak to the difference between a detention and a retention pond?
Yes. I mean, so yes and no, right? So the thing I will say is that the types of green infrastructure, there are many different types of green infrastructure, and they all have many different names. But the basic differences in many of them is how long are they designed to hold water. So we have some that are filtering processes, which are small things, and they're not supposed to hold water at all. They're supposed to have water supposed to go in there, and it's supposed to infiltrate into the ground somewhere where I can't see it, like maybe into my neighbor's basement. I don't know, but they're not designed to hold water. Others are designed to hold water for a short period of time. Others are designed to hold water for a medium period of time, and others are designed to be wet, to function as wetlands. And so the difference between detention and retention, what you have is a whole suite of processes that are designed to do different things with water. And I think originally we started where most of them were, I'm just trying to hold the water for as short as possible and then get rid of it. But now they've realized that, well, if you can hold water and you can develop some of these wetland type of features, then maybe that's worthwhile. And so there's now really a wide range of detention, retention, wet ponds, dry ponds, all depending on what they do with the water and what they're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. Was the denitrification analysis done on different soil types to determine if soil type affects the ability of the detention pond to remove nitrogen?
Yes, and so we have been sampling lots of detention ponds and features in lots of places, and so there's a lot of interest in what kind of soils are used in these features, right? So in many cases, especially for the highly engineered features, you're using engineered soils which are made to certain specifications. And we were quite concerned that some of these soils were not going to have a high capacity for biological activity, including denitrification. But denitrification is not a super subtle process. And so if the soil is wet and it's got some organic matter in it, it's going to denitrify. And so some of these soils, and as you can see, we found very high denitrification rates in these detention basin soils and these stormwater functions, just because the soils were wet, the soils had organic matter in it, and they denitrified quite nicely. And in that paper, we collected a lot of data which are publicly available. And we do the synthesis work. We had a student just got her PhD doing the synthesis work. She took hundreds of measurements that we made over the last 20 years, and they all fall out. If you plot denitrification potential versus soil moisture and denitrification potential versus organic matter content, it falls out pretty well. And it's almost too simple, right? For a scientist, I'm not supposed to give simple answers, but if the soils are wet and they've got some organic matter, they're going to denitrify, and that's a useful finding.
Great, thank you. We're focused on riparian buffers around flowing water, but do ponds and lakes have riparian buffers as well?
Yeah, for sure. And again, the interface between a pond and a lake and the upland is also super important, and for lots of the same reasons. Now, like things like stream shading, right? So if you have a big pond, so then the edge effect is not that big, but certainly in small ponds, the presence of vegetation around the pond provides shading, and it provides organic matter, and it stabilizes the banks. And so there's, especially in the Midwest where they have a lot of lakes, there's a lot of work with landowners next to the lakes to manage the interface between the lake and the upland much more carefully. And in particular, we all have a desire to take away dead wood, right? So we have dead logs floating in the stream, and I don't know, we all seem to have an irresistible desire to pull those out and take them away. And the dead wood's like super useful, right? It's super important for fish habitat and for all kinds of stabilization things. And so there's been a lot of good work of engaging with landowners next to the lakes to manage the land a little more carefully.
Great. We've got a number of questions coming in related to buffer width. So I'm going to try to summarize maybe 3 different questions, also acknowledging that we have 3 more sessions in this series where we'll be talking more about buffer width and how local municipalities decide the width of buffers to protect. So we have one question about having a community using a rule of thumb of double the stream width. Is there a rule of thumb that can be used for buffer regulations? We've got it. I'm just going to give you all the questions, Peter, and then maybe you can give a broad brush. And
if they're too hard, I'm going to have a connection problem. I can tell right away.
Understood. That's fair enough. This stuff is hard, and that's why we're doing it. We have a question about buffer protection along intermittent streams that tends to be narrower, but wondering about the science to support that. And then also a question around width depending on the aquatic connectivity to the uplands, if there might be situations where a buffer isn't helpful and other avenues might be pursued. So just throwing 3 very different questions at you at once.
But I'm just glad to hear that these are still the questions, right? Because again, when I started back in this in the 80s, I was all excited. I was doing science that was relevant to society, and people just killed me. Like they were right away, well, how wide should the buffer zone be, guy? And I was like, I don't know. I still don't know, but the answer is it really depends on what you're trying to do in that buffer, right? So the idea of a rule of thumb that the buffer zone should be twice the width of the stream has great appeal, right? It's clear, everyone understands it. If you had a buffer zone that's twice the width of the stream, you're going to get some level of stream protection. I can't argue that that's not a useful thing. But it depends on, are you hoping that that buffer is going to provide shading for the stream? Are you hoping that it's going to process surface runoff, or are you hoping that it's going to process do groundwater filtering? Now, if you need it to shade the stream, well, then you're just going to have to make sure it's wide enough to support the growth of some mature tree vegetation. And in some cases, that's just, that's not going to be wide enough. If you're interested in surface runoff or groundwater filtering, a lot's going to depend on the soils there. Do you have wet soils or do you have dry soils there? And so I guess the recommendation we have had is if you can be specific about what you're trying to achieve, then it becomes easier to say how wide the buffer should be. But in many cases, we don't. We just have a design, an idea that it would be a good idea to protect these streams. And so then you can say, okay, we're going to come up with some kind of rule of thumb about twice the width of the stream. Not super specific, but it certainly scores very high on transparency and being clear to people. So I'll say that. With intermittent streams, right? So intermittent streams are just super important, right? So we think about these kind of we'd like to think about like hotspots in the landscape or flash points of reactivity in the landscape. And intermittent streams are irresistibly exciting in that way, and that they're dry, and lots of things happen during the drying down period, and then there's this flash of activity during the wet up period. And so intermittent streams they're super important for connectivity in the landscape, both riparian protections for the intermittent streams, but then also longitudinally down the stream. Like all of our streams in the headwaters, most of them are intermittent for long periods of time. And lots of stream ecologists spend a lot of time wringing their hands about trying to get people to recognize and protect intermittent streams. And so I just think we need to constantly recognize that, yes, even though the stream is dry for a while, it's connected and plays an important role. And so they need to be protected. The last question about are there some areas where the buffer zone wouldn't help? I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but one of the great things about riparian buffer zones is they have multiple benefits, right? So, and that's always I think has been a helpful concept of the interface between science and society. Okay, maybe I would like to, if I restore a riparian buffer zone of some width, it may not do everything I want. It may not do the specific thing that I'm most interested in, but it's not going to make things worse. And I can't think of any scenarios where it makes things worse. And so I'm not sure what the question was, but there is the general idea that I can't think of any examples where they make things worse.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a number of other really great questions, but we've reached the end of our time here. So Peter, if you have any publications or any additional information that you can share, we have a list of resources on our website, and I'd be happy to add those. We got a couple other questions asking about specific nitrate levels and detention pond function, and thinking you might have some resources to share that might help explain.
I will send you some papers, and the scientific papers are great. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, you sit down with these and you'll be out really fast. And I think that what's really exciting is groups like the Hudson River Watershed Association who are working that interface, like people who are waking up in the morning and saying, okay, I can understand the science, and how can I translate this into a format that other people can understand. And so I'm super excited to participate in something like this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. We've been recording this webinar, and I will be posting that and sending around a link to everyone who registered. For those of you who had some technical issues and then joined later, thank you so much for your perseverance and joining us today. And we hope to see you all next week at the same time, 1 p.m. for the next part of our series. So thank you so much.
Bye.